Is this thing still on?
I think they can hear us a bit better now. Should we keep talking?
Of course. Let's say it louder for those in the back. Hi, and welcome to the Gritty Nurse Podcast, an unfiltered discussion about health and healthcare. My name is Amy Archibald-Varley.
And my name is Sarah Fung.
And we are your podcast hosts.
If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, or any other podcast platform, don't forget to hit subscribe so you can get updates on new episodes.
If you love our podcast and our advocacy work, please go to www.grittynurse.com and click on the Support Us button. This will give you access to exclusive episodes and early releases on a monthly basis.
This will help us with the costs of running the podcast, the time and energy to put out awesome and informative episodes. And for that, we thank you and we appreciate you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again this week. And, this is such a really integral topic. I'm so glad that we have these two guests that are going to come on to talk about their book, Code White. And, I think Sarah and I, we've actually gone on other podcasts talking about this. This is a huge problem. This is a huge problem for healthcare, particularly for nurses. And, Sarah, could you introduce our guests today?
Absolutely. This is a topic that I think really should be discussed in nursing school, and it should be covered more in the media because nurses need to know what they're getting into before they start working. And if they've been on the job for a while, for them to know that they're not alone. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. James Brophy and Dr. Margaret Keith, who both have PhDs in environmental health from the University of Stirling in Scotland. As a couple and research partners, they have studied an extensive range of important occupational and environmental health issues. They have published numerous articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals and contributed several book chapters to academic publications. Together, they were awarded the Scientific Award from the Occupational Health section of the American Public Health Association for the rigor displayed in their groundbreaking occupational breast cancer research. They have just had a book published entitled Code White, Sounding the Alarm on Violence Against Healthcare Workers, which drew heavily on these three important research studies they conducted over the past 5 years. The first two focused on violence against healthcare staff in the hospital and long-term care settings, and the third on healthcare worker protection during the pandemic. Welcome, Jim and Mark. We're so glad to have you here today.
Oh, we're very pleased, and thank you for having us.
Maybe you could start by telling us why you decided to write your book and what that process was like.
I have thought about that a great deal, and we have talked about it a great deal. I think Marg and I have been involved in occupational health issues and advocacy for workers for almost 4 decades. During that time, we knew very little, heard very little about violence in the healthcare system. It wasn't until 2015 when we started collaborating with the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions that we first heard how widespread it was. They had an occupational health conference for their nurses in 2015, and every single nurse, there was 150 of them there, had been assaulted. Had been physically assaulted. And one of the nurses got quoted in a press release about the conference saying that this is a problem that needed to be, acknowledged and addressed. And she was fired when she got back to work in North Bay, Sue McIntyre. And that had a very dramatic effect on the union. So they asked us if we would do a study looking at violence in hospitals across the province, actually in 7 different locations. And we interviewed over 55, I think, some number like that, people, mostly in group settings. And then we did twice that number privately, individually, but in the official part of the research was in these group sessions. And often after the session was done, where we would ask them to talk about their work experience and their experience with violence and so forth, And the room, they would leave. Mark and I would be sitting by ourselves, getting our papers together. And we often said quietly and said, "What did we just hear? What did we just hear?" I hesitate to say it this way, but we're almost triggered by it. And why didn't we know about this? Devoted our lives to occupational health, and we just hear that in one of the major employers in the province, that violence has become so widespread, so pervasive, that it's now normalized to the point of seeing as part of the job, and
Right.
nobody is talking about this. And then as the sessions went on, we realized why nobody was talking about it, because people were afraid. People were intimidated. They all started the sessions with, about Sue McIntyre having been fired. Now, she did get her job back after a long
Two
arbitration,
years.
2 year arbitration process, but everybody knew about that. It had created a chilling effect within the union. We often had sessions where people would say, "Look, I just can't participate in this. It's too dangerous for me." And people would, because we went through a very elaborate informed consent and so on and so forth. So all of that is to say that Margaret said this. We really feel that our work now is to help unmute the voices of healthcare workers who haven't been allowed to speak, that have been intimidated and made to feel, have been blamed, and have had their stories left untold. That our job is to kind of bring this to the public, bring this to the larger society, so that their voices eventually can be heard. And that's essentially what we're trying to do with the book.
The title of our first article was Assaulted and Unheard, Violence Against Healthcare Workers. And we were saying afterwards, we really shouldn't have just said assaulted and unheard. We should have added blamed and silenced, because this is what really came out when we were doing this research. It's extremely widespread. The public doesn't know about it. Researchers don't know about it because the healthcare workers are not allowed to talk about it for fear of being reprimanded or even fired. And of course, there are so many things wrong with it, right? The fact that the majority of healthcare workers are women, many of them racialized, they're being silenced, they're being exploited and being silenced. There was a quote that we had in our book that I want to share about the importance of healthcare workers being able to speak publicly and to each other and to their family members and to whomever about issues such as violence and fear and discrimination, exploitation and burnout. So we said, unfortunately, the silencing of healthcare workers about violence on the job makes it difficult for them to reach out to anyone other than perhaps some coworkers or union representatives about what they're experiencing. Rebecca Solnit, who wrote a book about the silencing of women as a form of control, says, being unable to tell your story is a living death. Violence against women is often against our voices and our stories. Silence is what allowed predators to rampage through the decades unchecked. Having a voice is crucial. It is not all there is to human rights, but it is central to them. So you can consider the history of women's rights and lack of rights as a history of silence and breaking silence. So what we're trying to do is to help the healthcare workers to break the silence. And that's why we have written the book.
That is so, so important and such a powerful quote. And I think just even thinking about, ourselves as nurses and understanding kind of our own experience, it's to hear that, everybody in that room, 150 nurses, all of them had some form of abuse. And the fact that the main impetus for them not saying anything is fear of retribution, it almost it's unbelievable. Like, who is the victim in the situation here? Like, the nurses are the victims, but again, are the ones that feel that they can't speak out about this experience. That's so traumatizing. And it almost brings into stark reality what's happening in the pandemic as well, again, a large group that are not being listened to, that are being silenced. Again, it's kind of almost history repeating itself, but in a different form. It's actually quite devastating. And I wonder, and maybe you have some answers to this too. Why do you think the violence is against healthcare workers are so prevalent. Do you think it's because of the silencing? Is it multifactorial? Like, what do you think are some of the reasons you think that this continues to happen, and what might be some of the statistics?
Let me just say that it was something it just hit me, and we talked about this every time we did a session, and all through our analysis of the book. You cannot help but see the violence against healthcare workers as part of violence against women in our society. 85% of the healthcare workers are women. It's hard to imagine any other work environment that would tolerate such levels of abuse if the majority of the workers were not women. You could, the blaming, the shaming, the silencing, the normalization of it. People are put on the defensive. What did you do? How did
Mm-hmm.
you act? Like, here's the victim, right? This was happening to us session after session, and so we started researching as we were doing this. We were looking at the scientific literature, like what are the stories, and then so the statistics are pretty. We weren't doing a statistical study; we were doing a qualitative study. We wanted to know the lived experience of people, but the I wrote some of them down just so I would get them right. So among all occupational groups, healthcare workers bear the highest risk of violence. For example, between 2006 and 2015, there were over 16,000 violent related recorded lost time injuries among Canadian healthcare workers, compared to 7,500 among all other non-healthcare occupations. In terms of violent related injuries, lost time injuries for healthcare workers was 66%, increased by 66% between 2006 and 2015, which is 3 times the rate of increase for police and correctional service officers combined. Now,
Wow.
remember that the federal government task force standing committee on health said the same. These numbers are underestimations because
Yeah.
the vast majority of injured and assaulted healthcare workers don't report. They're
Right, right.
intimidated to report. They fear reprisals to report. The Ontario Council of Hospital Unions did a survey among 3,000 of their nurses and PSWs and found that 68% had been assaulted at least once in the last year, but only 57% had reported it. So these numbers that are striking are unbelievable, really. In our healthcare system, this is where this kind of thing is happening, are really underestimating how serious the problem is.
So when
Yeah,
we're
that's
talking,
really shocking.
yeah, and 42% had experienced sexual harassment or assault. 26% had lost time due to violence-related injuries in the past year. 20% had experienced at least 9 assaults in the past year. 83% non-physical violence, such as abusive language, name-calling, racially directed abuse, threatening gestures. When you talk about what really is behind all the violence, it's a really complex issue. So underreporting means that it's not being addressed because it's just not on the books, right? Even though you see these numbers and they look unbelievable, including the compensation numbers, but somehow, with all the underreporting, we just don't have a really good sense of how widespread it really is. There's the silencing, of course, but when you start to drill down, so there are the sort of the systemic causes, the societal causes. We do have systemic sexism, racism, classism, even. The healthcare workers are there to take care of you or whatever. So, you expect certain things from them if you're a patient who happens to feel entitled or whatever. The family members of a patient, they tend to take things out on the healthcare workers. But we also have seen a huge increase in violence in the last 20 years. And again, it's really hard for us to say exactly how much because of the lack of reporting and the lack of statistics. But we do know that a lot of things have changed in the last 20, 30 years. For one thing, there have been huge cuts to the real number of nurses and staff available to look after patients. Huge waits now in the ER. I remember when our children were young, if we had to take one of them to the ER, we would expect to go in and get right in. There might be a 5-minute wait. Now you can wait 13 hours. We have had that experience personally. Of course, people are angry. They're upset. They lose it, right? And who do they take it out on? Usually the nurse, the triage nurse, or whoever happens to be around. The staffing levels are just completely unmanageable. Ontario has the lowest number of beds and staff of all the provinces. When you compare us to all the other developed countries, we're sitting right at the bottom. I think we tie with Mexico for the number of staff and beds.
Nurse to patient ratios.
Right.
When we talk beds, we're really talking staff, right? Because I've seen it written that there's lots of furniture. It's not that we don't have the staff. So when you don't have enough staff, you have frustrated patients and family members. You also don't have the staff that you might need to have 2 or 3 people go in to handle somebody who's out of control. There are some workplaces and some areas of the hospitals and so on that may be a bit more dangerous than others. For instance, the ER, people are coming in off the street. Drugs are a much bigger problem than they used to be. But we also have, understaffing and wait times. We heard some horrendous stories of things that had taken place in the ER, but also in some of the forensic units, for instance. We told the story of Diane Paulin, who had gone in to work in her North Bay hospital. She was given a patient who had a history of violence. In fact, he was there because he had been, they had to call the police. He was living in a group home. He was in a group home because he had assaulted his family. They assaulted the staff at the group home. The police were called. He assaulted the police. They ended up taking him to this forensic unit. Diane ended up somehow alone in a room with him. He was upset because he wasn't able to use the phone. He wanted to use the phone. Anyway, he attacked her. He pinned her up against the door that automatically locked from the inside so that he couldn't get out while she couldn't get out. She was backed up against the door. He was coming at her. He got a chair, started pushing against her. She was screaming for help. People on the other side of the door, other patients, heard and called for help. A code white was finally called. She was fighting with all her strength, managed to push the chair and him away enough that the other staff were able to come in, finally got things under control. But not before. She had suffered a severe concussion, serious, bruising, trauma, of course, PTSD. She ultimately ended up losing her teeth. She had been punched in the face so many times. She never was able to work again. I was going to read just a little excerpt again from the book. I was barricaded behind the door with a chair hard against me. He pounded on my head, my face, and on my shoulders. He was yelling and screaming while he punched me. And then she went on to talk about having gone to the ER. She was given painkillers, and after a few hours was sent home, woke up the next morning to find herself covered in bruises, hardly able to walk. We met her 6 years after the incident when she was speaking at a conference on violence against healthcare workers. She, at that point felt it was safe to get up and speak about her experiences because there was no chance she was ever going back to work. She couldn't. She was just too hurt and too traumatized. So shaking, her voice quivering, she stood bravely in front of a large group of nurses, PSWs, aides, maintenance staff, and other allied healthcare workers and talked about the attack and about her injuries. She talked about the litany of callous disregard and abuse that came afterwards from her employer and the compensation board. She described how the indifference and even contempt she experienced from her employer and the compensation system in the aftermath of the attack compounded the harm from the original injuries and left her traumatized and ultimately impoverished. The delegates and the two of us were moved to tears. We did interview her a year later and heard, more about how she had been treated by the comp system, who agreed that, okay, she couldn't go back to work in the hospital. She had tried, couldn't do it. Tried to set her up as a customer complaints rep, which didn't work out. They had all these angry people coming in complaining about service, and I think it was stores. She wasn't able to do that job. She fought for the longest time to be able to get compensation. Finally did, but
Lost her
it was
home.
lost her home. She, had gone through such trauma. In fact, they tried to use the fact that she had been abused as a child to say, well, that's the cause of your PTSD, not the
That's
violent
horrible.
incident.
Wow.
So there's so much more to this than just what happens in the workplace. It's how the whole system treats people when they try to talk about it or when they try to file for compensation. The support system isn't there that is so important. And when you think about it, somebody who is sexually assaulted, right? They're told they should go to a sexual assault crisis center. There's counseling, very inadequate, all of it. But there's nothing like that for the healthcare workers who are assaulted, often sexually assaulted as well. They're expected to just, get back to the job. We heard a story of someone who was horribly sexually assaulted. She was alone in a shower with a man who was in his 50s, big and strong, who had mild dementia. He attacked her and had her pinned up against the wall, was penetrating her with his fingers through her scrubs. She fought to get away, managed finally to talk to the nurse manager who was in charge, and was told, okay, well, luckily you didn't get hurt. Thank goodness you're okay. Get back to work. She was not okay. She was so traumatized. She was shaking. She was sick. She realized how incredibly close she had come to being raped. As it was, she was,
Right.
viciously
Hmm.
assaulted. But it was treated, dismissed as if it was nothing. So, and there was a lot that happened after that as well. But this disregard for the trauma that healthcare workers experience when all this goes on, I think is a very serious problem. There should be ongoing counseling. There should be ongoing debriefing that is positive and supportive, not the kind of debriefing that we heard the nurses went through after an incident when they would report it, and first thing they'd be asked is, okay, what did you do? How did you approach the patient? Instantly it was on them that they had to have done something wrong. So, there's a lot that needs to be done to prevent violence. There's also a lot that needs to be done to support the healthcare workers.
Wow, those are some powerful stories. I mean, like, I can't even imagine going through what these women have gone through. And what you talked about was the lack of support. And I feel like it's just the assault is just the beginning, right? Because you have to suffer all of these other steps and re-traumatization of trying to explain your story and not feeling validated, feeling like you're being blamed actually for what happened. And I think back to what you said about the statistics of violence in healthcare versus police officers. And I think the general public would assume that police officers suffer a greater rate of violence. And even police officers have tools to protect them. They have a gun, they have a bulletproof vest. What do nurses have? We maybe have a security guard if you're lucky. We don't have any protection. And I think this is really important that we are basically so vulnerable. And with the system the way it is right now, I can only imagine that things are going to get worse. You talked a lot about fear and silencing in nursing, and I know in your book you told of a few stories where PSWs or nurses were assaulted and were told to get back to work. So after suffering an assault, they literally have to go back and finish their care on the patient that just assaulted them. Like, I can't imagine how difficult that must be. And I think in any other industry, you would not have to do that. So I just feel like this is so shocking. And not only that, but to find people to actually be brave enough to speak and share their stories. I noticed that in your book most people use their first and last names. How did that work for you? Like, how were you able to find individuals who are willing to step forward and be vulnerable and share their experiences with you?
We were collaborating with the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions. And so they were the ones that put out the word that if anyone wanted to participate, that they could come to these sessions, and we would have these focus groups sessions. But at every one of the sessions, we had people that would say, look, you know what? I really wanted to participate. I really want to help. But the more I think about it, I just don't feel safe doing that. I can't. And this is, as I mentioned, we had gone through the ethics committee at the University of Windsor and at the University of Stirling in Scotland. We had very strict guidelines about what information we had to, and what protections we had to provide anybody who participated. And we in our studies, we never said what cities we went to. We never said what their facilities were. We didn't use their names. In fact, we were the only ones that really had access to their names, and we destroyed that information once our study was published in a scientific journal. So even with all those guarantees, it gave us a sense of how vulnerable uh, the healthcare workers are. And you were asking, I just want to add if I could, just one point onto what Margaret was articulating about the causes of this. We have had a 30, 40-year history now in Ontario and in Canada of what I think we broadly call neoliberal capitalism. This idea that, the role of the government is to encourage the markets and to back away from regulatory controls and funding of public institutions. And so we've had, decades long underfunding, understaffing, uh, privatization. I mean, over half the long-term care facilities now are in private hands.
Right. Yeah.
We don't even build our hospitals without private, partnerships,
Yep.
even though the Auditor General says it's costing us billions of dollars, because this is the role that the government thinks it should be playing in the economy. The consequences of that is we have this completely underfunded, understaffed healthcare system and an increasingly acute patient population, population that has more and more health-related issues and less supports. And so the staff are the first line of the frustration that people are feeling.
Right.
And then it gets mixed in, of course, as what we were saying, the overwhelmingly female, the gender makeup of the workforce, they become immediately targeted. Um, so, I think that these systemic causes, we tried to talk about that in the book. We also have a whole list of things that could be done, everything from, code whites and flagging and security and even the design of the buildings. And these were all the ideas that the
Personal alarms.
personal alarms. But I mean, one nurse told us that she was at a conference and she went for a coffee and she was talking to another delegate who works in the laundry, and the woman in the laundry was saying that every time I come on to certain floors, I have to put on an alarm. And the nurse was saying, an alarm? Oh yeah, everybody has to have an alarm, in case there's any violent incidents on there. She said, well, at the hospital I work at, the only thing we can do is scream. You know,
Oh my
so you
God.
get a sense that there's this lack of resources that's very unequal and very, in some places they literally don't exist, and in other places they might have a bit more. So, maybe some of the hospitals in Toronto might have something that, in Kenora or, Thunder Bay, there's not a
Right.
chance, you know.
Hearing these things is really difficult, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think the first thing we need to call it out as what it is. It is just gender discrimination on the face of it. We can't shy away from the fact that nursing and predominantly healthcare, where we're working closely with patients, is predominantly female. Is predominantly There is a large group that are racialized as well, and we can't forget we've seen how those narratives play out when it comes to women's rights and when it comes to women asking for better protections. And I think that, people are jumping up and down about, I don't know if you've heard of this, the Bill C3, which they've been talking about just recently. It's now why we might need this law to kind of protect healthcare workers, and really because in the pandemic we've seen those threats and aggressors towards and intimidating behavior towards professionals. But again, that was lobbied heavily by the physician group, which again is male dominated as well. And again, it doesn't, for me, go far enough, because really at the end of the day, what it says is the bill is going to fulfill a liberal promise that was to bring in a new law to tackle rising harassment of healthcare workers. But we're talking about physical violence that is occurring. And really employers should be actually encouraging their workers to press charges. Like in that instance where you had mentioned that nurse was sexually assaulted, she should have her manager should have been like, "Yeah, you should press charges against this person, patient or not." I think at the end of the day, and I think this goes with our nursing training, we sometimes forget we're in this nursing patient relationship where we forget that we're people at the end of the day. We're still human beings that have feelings, that have rights. And it doesn't working at a hospital and working as a nurse doesn't supersede the right of being a human being and deserving protection. So I think we need to move away from some of these narratives that we've been taught in nursing school, that we've been taught by our healthcare workers and other people around us. And we really need to I'm sorry to say, but kind of like stick it to the man. Like I think we've been hearing stories about outrages at South Lake. And I'm almost thinking that, we have a lot of lawyers that listen to our podcast. Maybe there should be a class action lawsuit against a lot of these hospitals that are allowing this abuse to occur. We need to actually have better systems in place. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, what do you think we can do to improve the situation? I mean, I know that, for example, nurses have been told not to call the police or, just put it in the internal reporting system and we'll follow up. What are some other things that we can do?
There are several levels, right? There are things that individuals can do. There are things that the unions can do. There are, there's strength in numbers, of course, and the more people you bring on board, the more likely you are to be influential and safer.
I agree.
Building coalitions, connecting up with some of the coalitions that exist. Even, you're talking about the physicians having been somewhat influential in trying to get this legislation to protect healthcare workers. One of the things to say about all of that too is those threats against healthcare workers around pandemic related issues have been very public, unlike what is happening behind closed doors in the hospital. So it's already out there publicly. One of the big things is we've got to get this issue out in the public. The fact that violence is happening every day behind those doors to healthcare workers. It's not visible. It needs to be visible. There's been this, we called it surplus powerlessness. We borrowed that term in the book. Once people have been made to feel that they are not powerful or they are even deserving of the abuse that or the exploitation that they experience, the less likely they are to fight back. Overcoming that is going to be a huge issue. I think it's starting. I honestly think that violence now is more on the tip of people's tongues than it has been. It's we got a long way to go. But I would like to read another little excerpt from the book if I could. One of the first steps towards justice for healthcare workers is to reject the assertion that violence is part of the job or that boys will be boys. These are manipulative lies intended to disempower workers, to make them feel like giving up. There is safety and power in numbers. While collective resistance is key to making systemic and structural changes, healthcare workers can all exercise some agency at an individual level. We can choose not to quietly endure the grabbing, sexual comments, and racist insults and threats. Healthcare workers can tell within bounds. A nurse who was interviewed for the O2QP Voices booklet said she felt a moral obligation to tell the public what's really going on behind the healthcare institution's door. She said, I'm speaking out now because people are going to get hurt. People are already getting hurt, and it's just going to get worse. It's not going to get any better because they're not listening to anybody about safety issues that we have. Staff should not be getting barricaded in the rooms and so on. So, I think it's, again, just like the question of why is violence happening, it's complex. How do we fix it? It's complex. We need to be working to challenge it. We need to be working to prevent violence at so many different levels. But having the public on side, I think, would really make a difference. So figuring out some way to safely get the word out. And thank you for doing what you're doing with this podcast, because I think this is an important
Huge.
step in getting the word out. I think people do follow you, and I'm so pleased to be able to talk about this issue.
I think that, the health of the healthcare workers is a great barometer of the health of the healthcare system. And
Absolutely.
if workers in the healthcare system are being abused and are vulnerable, like this tells us they are, then it's going to have a dramatic effect on the quality of care that people can get and have. So it's in everybody's interest. I also wanted just to share one story that's quickly in the book. I just did it very quickly, but I thought it was very telling for us, especially when we were talking about violence against women and the parallels in the healthcare system. Was in 2019, Time magazine designated the Person of the Year to be the Me Too movement. And the cover of, I don't know if you saw this, but the cover of it was pictures of different women in different occupations that had spoken out, that had raised all of this, whatever, and it brought this to the public and said, drew the line, no more. With all these different faces, there was, I think, maybe 6 or 7. There was a shoulder, like not a face, just a shoulder. And we were thinking, what is this? And in the story, the shoulder was the shoulder of a nurse who had spoken out about all this, but was so afraid, was so fearful of reprisal that she couldn't have her face on the cover of an international magazine, Person of the Year. To me, that said everything really we needed to know about this. If you don't feel that you're protected in that kind of environment, then it really gives you a sense of what Marg is describing, of the sense of powerlessness to be heard and respected. And I think it starts really there.
That's a really good point, Jim. And you know what? It's actually funny that you mentioned it. We actually have a little bit of connections and ties to Times Up in the States as well. So we actually were on the Visible Voices podcast, and Dr. Riza Lewis is actually one of the founders of Times Up Healthcare. And maybe that's what we need here in Canada. Maybe we should have a chapter of Times Up Healthcare in Canada, where we have accountability structures where we're holding organizations accountable for this victimization and abuse that happens to healthcare workers. Maybe we need that accountability structure where we're holding people's feet
Absolutely.
to the fire to say, hey, this is something that's happening. We're not going to let this happen anymore. And we have a lot of people standing behind us saying that enough is enough. I think people think when we talk about, nurses leaving in droves, that they think it's just COVID. COVID is just like the icing on the cake. It has been the abuse, the silencing, the not being listened to for years and years and years, and now toppled, and on top of that with COVID, people are just saying enough is enough.
Well, even how the healthcare workers were treated through the pandemic. I mean,
Oh, it's
Yep.
horrible.
Yep.
the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions and SEIU have been bargaining together with the Ontario Hospital Association. Their bargaining broke off on, get this, the two issues: violence, to get language in
Wow.
the collective agreements on violence, and to get proper respiratory protection. I mean, along with this defunding and all of that, we've had a complete collapse of our regulatory system. So, one of the things we found in our studies was that the health and safety committees weren't meeting.
Right.
There was reported in the Toronto, and we knew this from our study we did on the pandemic and what was going on with workers, but it was confirmed. The Toronto Star used freedom of information. There was something like 250 work refusals in the hospitals in the first year or so of the pandemic. Almost all of them are over proper respiratory protection. So, for instance,
Right.
Hmm.
a pregnant cleaner ordered to go into a room of a former COVID patient to clean it, asked for an N95. No, the Ministry of Labor doesn't support her. She's forced to go into that room. We had a nurse that had a horrible story around all of that,
Did
and
end up getting COVID.
did end up
Seriously.
getting COVID.
She had been denied proper respiratory equipment. The ministry did not uphold one of the work
Not
refusals
one.
because they were following the mandates that were put out by the province, which was still denying that COVID is airborne. And there
Right.
still
Right.
is adequate respiratory protection. The other thing to say, during the pandemic, the issue of violence against health workers
Increased.
really increased. In various surveys, it's been shown that violence has actually increased, and I think this is partly because the you know people are incredibly frustrated. They weren't able to have family members coming in to help, and which meant that, the nurses were all they had, and so they were taking everything out on the nurses. Again, frustration, fear, all of those things, whatever the reasons.
None of them
Health,
acceptable, by the way.
Healthcare workers were subjected to more violence at the same time that they were being denied protection, basic protection. And we're not talking about a lot of money here. Providing people with N95s is not going to break the bank. But what I think is behind it is that it's caving in to the healthcare workers who were saying, you need to protect me. I mean, try to figure that out, right? But it would be so simple to protect them. They could do a lot to protect them, and they're not.
They were literally putting N95s under lock and key.
Yes.
Like they were narcotics. They were putting them in like bins where nurses could not access them. They would need like a manager approval. This is ludicrous. It is insane. No other profession would be treated the way that nurses were during this pandemic. It's unreal that, they treated us childlike. You can't do this. You don't have the knowledge, skill, and judgment to make this call. We need to put these things away from you guys because we can't trust that you're going to take care of this. It's unbelievable how disrespectful nurses have been treated.
Normally I don't recommend reading a Royal Commission report unless you're suffering from insomnia or something like that. In this particular case, the SARS Royal Commission is worth a look. That everything we're describing, the four of us are talking about here tonight, was in the SARS experience. What happened, in Toronto, 2003 with the SARS deal. The recommendations were, that N90, first of all, that the precautionary principle should be applied.
Assume it's airborne.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah, assume it. N95s. In fact, N95s were stockpiled in the millions after the Royal Commission, but they never properly monitored it. So when they finally did, they found that all the respirators had expired, the straps on the back. So they got rid of all of them. So when
they didn't replace them.
SARS Royal Commission says you must build a culture of safety in the hospitals. You must talk to the healthcare workers, listen to the nurses, listen to the doctors, listen to the unions. And he specifically tells the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Labor to go and do these things. Like everything that got completely shoved aside in the pandemic, this was supposed to be the roadmap of how you deal with the pandemic, was totally ignored.
And front and center was the precautionary principle. Follow the precautionary principle.
Listen to the workers, respect them.
This was a novel virus. We didn't really understand it. So you treat it as if it is airborne, it is dangerous. You do everything you can to protect people. And yes, that didn't happen.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't make any sense to me either. And I was reading actually a book by Andre Picard this weekend. And basically he said, in Canada, we're really, really great at writing reports, but we're not good at acting on them. So we put out a lot of great reports and we do these, investigations and we have these great recommendations, but we don't act on them for whatever reason. And, SARS was in 2003. So we're 18 years later. This is not something that just happened, a couple of years ago. We've had more than ample time to act on it. And just speaking about N95 respirators, at one point in the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of places were allowing hospitals to use expired N95 because it was just the elastic they determined was the part that would expire. It's just crazy. And then the fact that we had heard from healthcare workers earlier in the pandemic that they were reusing N95s, they were reusing surgical masks because they were not being given anything. And I can't believe that this is what it's come to and what we have to put up with if we want to continue working in the field.
You had PSWs using garbage bags. I mean, how bad is it? We knew that long-term care was going to be a disaster because we had just finished our study on violence. We knew exactly what the conditions were in there. When the very first thing as the pandemic starts to unfold, Margaret and I are saying to each other, "Oh my God, it's going to be a disaster in long-term care." And how bad does it have to be that it's young Canadian soldiers who get put into these long-term care saying these are worse conditions than they've seen in all the countries that they've been stationed in and blah, blah, blah. Like, it took Canadian soldiers to finally blow the whistle on this. Why wasn't anyone listening to the healthcare workers, to ONA, to
And really, nothing has changed.
no,
We're still just talking about it, that we need to do more to protect, the residents and staff in long-term care. Nothing's changed.
Mm-hmm.
no. In fact, if anything,
So,
Yeah.
they're getting exempt from any kind of court legal actions. You raised this question: why is this happening to us? And of course, we have a nice big pot. We could throw all kinds of stuff into it. I think one of the factors is the lack of power that healthcare workers in general, nurses, of course, is the largest group of healthcare workers in particular, the lack of power they have over their working conditions and over the conditions of their work. So, you can't strike. Your rights for, under the health and safety laws are circumscribed. There's all kinds of places where you can't refuse. The public expects that you'll continue to do this work even under horrendous conditions, and you have no way of challenging that and saying, no, this is not right. This is, we're not going to work under these kinds of conditions, and that's what I think you're seeing now. Nurses voting with their feet.
and you're
They're,
being
they're
kept divided, you know, through fear, right? Because you have to be, for whatever reason, your employer seemed to hold most of the cards. And of course,
Yeah.
to go back again to this issue of, you don't really have public support because the public doesn't really know what's going on. I don't think the public understands how unprotected you are during the pandemic either. So they see the rallies and that sort of thing outside the hospitals.
which are horrendous.
But and I know the healthcare workers have been speaking out, and there have been rallies of healthcare workers saying we need protection. There have been rallies around the issue of violence and so on. Somehow they just don't seem to get the press that the crowds do that are out to.
But even if you get the press, and there's been a lot of press and stuff when we release the studies and so forth, but the political people that are controlling the administrative decisions and the purse here, they're not budging.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the legislation you're getting and so on. Yeah, look at the healthcare SEIU and OCHU. Their contract, they can't, they have no way of striking. They have no, withdrawing their labor. So they're locked into a process that's very unfair and unequal. And it breaks off because they want protection against violence and they want proper respiratory protection. I mean, really, when you think about that's what broke off the negotiations?
I think there is some good news here. I mean, I think we are starting to talk about this. I also think, it's very clear when we're talking about the issue of violence, we've found the cure. Looking at the 2,000 or so articles that have already been published around the world on it, and talking to the hundreds of healthcare workers that we've talked to, we have a roadmap. We know exactly what needs to be done to protect healthcare workers from violence. And some of it's going to take some investment. Some of it is going to just take respect for the healthcare workers, listening to the healthcare workers. We know how to protect healthcare workers in the pandemic. That's good news, right? We know how to do it, but we're not doing it. So, the next big step, I think, is getting that groundswell of support that you need and getting together and saying, all right, you know what, we deserve better than this, and getting your allies on
Absolutely.
side, and it can be fixed. We just need the will and the influence to get it done.
I think this is what Amy and I have been trying to do from the beginning, is be the change that we want to see. So we feel that not just violent incidents, but nursing in general, there is so much fear and silencing. So we're taught to advocate for patients and care for patients, but never really ourselves. And so we want nurses to know it's okay to speak up, because Amy and I have been doing this for 2 years. And I remember the first time we did a media interview, we thought the world was going to end. Well, it didn't. And we went on to do more. And I think that just speaking about the power of social media, like that's how you get people on board. And this is how you reach people of influence, is having your own platform. And this is also why we decided to create this podcast, because we felt that no one was listening, and we just had this idea to try something and see if it would work. So I think that's one way to look at it, is just try to go out on your own and share your story that way if you feel that you're reaching out to people and no one's really responding the way you want them to.
I think what the two of you are doing is amazing. I think it's exactly, the fact that you're risk takers and prepared to speak publicly and encourage other people to speak publicly, like you do not only on your podcast but in the Toronto Star and in all these other places. Twitter, of course.
And I can tell you at the beginning, I at least was very hesitant to use my last name. I wanted to go by a first name basis, and then I thought, you know what? I need to be a real person and, like, not just go by a first name like Madonna or whatever. Like, I am a person and it's okay, because I saw doctors doing it all the time. And I thought, why is it that nurses are always on a first name basis, but doctors never worry about that kind of thing?
And in a way, the more you're out there publicly, the more protection there is as well. So
Right.
an individual just on their own who, decides to speak to a single reporter or whatever, may be more at risk than someone who's really out there talking about this. You're kind of famous, right? When you're
Well, I don't know about
In our
that.
world, you are. I
so
don't know.
that gives you some protection. Anyway, Amy, you were going to say something.
I was gonna say, you know what? I do see that there is a groundswell. I do see that. I mean, if, like Sarah was saying, if we look back 2 years ago, the only nurses that we ever really saw speaking in the media were executives. The fact that there are frontline nurses coming out and telling their stories and feeling comfortable to tell their stories, I feel like Sarah and I have actually been able to mobilize some action. And I think that more people are going to do it. The more that they see that representation, that those risks that people are saying, or people saying that they're going to be punished, they're going to see more people like myself and Sarah doing this work, and nothing happens. But what happens is we see action, we see change. And I think the more people get on board and say, you know what, enough's enough, I need to tell my story, because that's what Sarah and I do. We're really, at the end of the day, storytellers and trying to bring other people's stories to the light. And I think the more that they feel that, it's a safe place, we're happy to tell these stories too, that I think we'll start to see change. And again, it's not even just about telling your story, but also, we have to lobby the government. We have to get out there. We have to be political. We have to say that enough's enough. We need to know who our local MPPs are and our MPs. And we have to be a part of that arena as well. I think that's a new space for nurses to navigate, but it's a very important space for them to be in. And we do need stronger unions. I know there's a new union president coming in, and I hope that she's going to do some really difficult work, because there's a lot of change that we need to have a stronger union in Ontario. And I think that, nurses have had enough. We're sick of it. And I really hope that we see change. And I'm
Yes,
hopeful that we
absolutely.
will, right, Sarah?
And you know what? Just in the interest of time, I just wondered, Marg, and Jim, if we could ask if there are any last things you wanted to touch upon before we wrap up for today.
I just want to end by affirming what Amy just said about the union, because I think that is a very important thing. And I think it's really important for nurses to recognize that there's a lot of non-nursing healthcare workers that share your vulnerabilities, that not PSWs. I mean, some of the worst sexual assaults and so on we heard were from, respiratory therapists and physiotherapists and clerks, ER, and cleaners, and people in dietary. And I think healthcare historically has been a very hierarchical occupation, mostly male physicians at the top and so on, and then, down the road. And I know that nurses have a long history of, fighting for their profession, fighting for their role, fighting for respect. And I know that's a very important thing, but sometimes that kind of thing may blind you to the other people that are around you. The old labor slogan that an injury to one is an injury to all really needs to be applied in the healthcare setting. I mean, I think anytime there's an assault in the hospital or in long-term care or any health facility, every healthcare worker needs to see that as an attack on themselves, on them. I think, very progressive people like both of you and the people that I'm sure you're working with, keep that in the back of your head, if you will. But a lot of our study is with not just nurses, But with all of these healthcare workers and the situations that they face is just horrendous, and their voice is really not heard.
Mhm.
Yeah, an attack on one woman is really an attack
You
on
know, we
all
need to
women,
stop treating
absolutely.
violence and even protection during the pandemic as a sort of a technical issue or administrative or whatever. It's deeply political, and I think your idea of lobbying the politicians and so on is really important. The best way to do that, though, you need power. They at least think they have all the power right now and control. To get the power to be able to fight back and to be able to lobby, you do need to do it collectively. And I think, you've talked about all those ways that you might do that. And I think, we need to look at this not as a scientific or technical issue, but very much as a political and economic issue.
And a human rights issue.
And a human rights issue and a women's issue and so on.
Jim and Mark, thank you so much for your insight. I have learned so much. I'm sure Amy has as well. For our listeners, if they wanted to find you or buy your book, how can they do that?
We have the copy of the book. It's published by Between the Lines. It's available at your bookstore.
Or directly from Between the Lines, even on Amazon. You find us on Twitter.
No worries. Thank you so much for coming on our show today.
We're very thrilled, and we think the work you guys are doing is just awesome. It gives us real hope that, that this thing won't go on and on.
Thank you so much.
Okay.